Sup, chat? Welcome back to another podcast. I kind of forgot what I called the other one from last or first trimester, but it had to do with Jedi theme. And I guess I'm the Last Jedi and your last resort. I should be your last resort because she's your last resort for history. History Unlocked, a podcast where we simplify to make sense of the past in the present. Today we're gonna be talking and diving into the Cold War, which wasn't fought with swords, or tanks, just influence ideologies and communism. All right, so how did the Cold War begin? What were its origins and how did it start? Back in 1949, as we know, World War II ended. Nazi threats were crushed, and two superpowers were emerging at the time, which they were allies for a little bit. Allies, in quotes. But there's still a lot of tension even during World War II between the Soviets and the U.S. They may have fought with each other, but their economies were complete opposites. It was democracy, pretty much democracy versus communism. After the war, the tensions rose. And both sides had different visions. For Europe, I guess the U.S. pushed for more democratic and free market states, and the Soviets wanted secure borders, and they wanted buffer states of communism. Also known as satellite states. All right, one way that influence was shown in the Cold War that I would say the U.S. at first did one up the Soviets during this was nuclear warfare, and they had nuclear standoffs. As we know, during World War II, the U.S. did drop Little Boy and was it Big Brother on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which showed the amount of power that the U.S. had at the time, and it really showed the influence that you can have in a democratic, free market society. So to combat this, the Soviets began testing their own atomic bombs, which ended the kind of I'll call it a American monopoly of you know atomic bombs, being that they were the only country that was really mass producing them. Mass production is a crazy word. That were stockpiling them. But they weren't for defense as the issues that they were used for offense as they used on Japan. So to show influence and intimidation, the Soviets was as well start to build atomic bombs, stockpiling them, even having a greater number at one point as the U.S. in 1962. The closest we've been to actually to a nuclear war, and as most would say, destroying the whole world, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviets had nukes in Cuba, just not too far off, I think about 100 miles from the U.S. coast. And there was tension for about 2 weeks, eventually coming to an agreement to remove the missiles out of Cuba, and as well as the U.S. removed their missiles out of Turkey. Another example of the most popular, probably example that most people do know the Cold War for was the space race. The space race was from 1957 to 1969. Well, missiles were pointed down, the rockets pointed up. In 1957, the Soviets launched the Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite, and the U.S. was stunned. The question really was, is the USSR or the Soviets, are they going to win space too? This was probably the most stunning and astonishing feat that's been done during the Cold War at the time so far. So the Soviets were deemed to have been more advanced. Communism was proven to be a beneficial way to advance a society, and this started the space race. The U.S. Embedded this with NASA, and as we all know, the first humans to land on the moon. Controversial, that's for another story. It's for another day. In 1969, as Neil Armstrong said, it's a giant leap for mankind when he stepped foot on the moon, which was an American. Which shows, and it's good PR, I guess. It's good PR during the Cold War for the U.S., and it shows that you can send humans to space. And if I can't have Europe, I might as well have space. All right, another way of influence during the Cold War that was indirect, but this is probably the most direct I think it got, in my opinion, were the proxy wars that we talked about in class. The proxy wars were like wars that were fought using the U.S. and the Soviets, and they were always against each other, but they just weren't on American or Soviet soil, pretty much. Example of this is the Korean Wars, where North Korea was backed by communists and South Korea was backed by Americans and democracy. This divided the Koreas. Eventually, it did end up in quote unquote Soviet communist, the Viet Cong winning the war. Some say it did, some say they did, but overall, the war still is an armistice. Armistice. However you say that. And the U.S. was just trying to stop the spread of communism in the North by combating with the South, and got pretty close until some guy in an interview wanted to say something that he probably shouldn't have said about nuking China, which led China to sending 500,000 troops to North Korea. And overall, most people say that, the U.S. didn't lose this war, but they did end up backing down. So it proved significant, even though it's still an armistice today. All right, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, self-inflicted, most would say, by a Soviet himself, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the leader of the Soviets in 1985. He introduced different reforms and policies like Glasnost and Perestroika, I think it was. Also in 1989, during his lead, the Berlin Wall fell after the U.S. was assisting the West and aiding its people, also aiding in $400 million to Turkey and other countries. Basically, just Eastern Europe's communist governments just collapsed slowly, and finally an official